In the summer of 1907, a woman stepped off a train in northern Minnesota carrying a machine that most people had never seen before. It was heavy, it was fragile, and it could do something that, until that decade, no human being had ever been able to do. It could capture a voice and keep it. Her name was Frances Densmore, and she had come to the reservations of the Ojibwe to record their songs before, as the government of the time coldly assumed, those songs vanished forever. She expected melodies. She expected drums and prayers, and the ordinary music of a people the outside world was already working to forget. What she did not expect was to be told, quietly and repeatedly, about the ones who came before. The tall ones, the hairy ones, the people who had walked this land when the world looked nothing like it does now. And what she wrote down in her notebooks over the next 30 years would sit in a government archive, largely unread, for the better part of a century. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. To understand what happened in those notebooks, you have to understand who Frances Densmore actually was. She was not a treasure hunter. She was not a showman selling a story to a crowd. She was a trained musician from Red Wing, Minnesota, a woman who had studied piano and harmony and who, by the standards of her era, had every reason to live a quiet and respectable life. Instead, she became one of the most relentless field researchers the Smithsonian ever employed. Working under the Bureau of American Ethnology, she traveled from community to community with her recording equipment and her endless stacks of blank wax cylinders. She would sit with an elder for hours. She would ask them to sing, and then she would write down not just the notes, but everything around the song, the meaning, the occasion, the story behind it. Over her long career, she gathered thousands of recordings from dozens of nations. But it was her early work among the Ojibwe, published in 2 thick government volumes, that first put her name in the record. And it was in the margins of that work, in the parts nobody was ever meant to pay attention to, that the strangeness begins. Her Ojibwe work was not a single visit. It stretched across years and across the reservations of the northern woods, White Earth and Red Lake and Leech Lake among them, communities strung through the lake country where the old life still held on in pockets. The 2 volumes she produced, published by the Bureau under the title of Chippewa Music, ran to hundreds of pages and hundreds of songs, each transcribed by hand, each annotated with the context she had pried loose through patience. To read them today is to feel the sheer labor of it. A single woman, decade after decade, sitting with people the wider society had written off, treating their knowledge as though it were the most valuable thing in the country, which, though almost nobody around her agreed, it may well have been. And because she cast her net so wide and sat so long, she caught things a shorter, narrower study would have missed entirely. The strange material did not arrive in a flood. It arrived in drops, one aside at a time, across years of listening, which is exactly how you would expect a real memory to surface, and exactly the opposite of how you would expect a fabricated legend to be delivered. It is worth stopping on the machine itself, because the machine is why any of this survives. Densmore worked with a phonograph that etched sound into soft wax as a person sang into a horn. Each cylinder held only a few minutes. The wax was delicate, prone to cracking in the cold and softening in the heat, and she hauled crates of the things across rough country by wagon and by foot. When a cylinder was full, that was it. There were no second takes without cost, no editing, no cleaning up a performance later. So Densmore learned to listen with a patience that few researchers of any era have matched. She learned the protocol of asking. She learned who to approach, and how, and when to simply sit and say nothing. Trust was the whole game. An elder does not hand over the deepest songs of a people to a stranger with a machine unless that stranger has proven she will treat what she is given with respect. Densmore proved it, community after community, year after year. And that is the reason the difficult material reached her at all. She had earned the kind of confidence in which people tell you the things they do not tell outsiders, including the things the outsiders were guaranteed to mock. The Minnesota she walked into in the early 1900s was a place in the middle of being erased. The old ways of the Ojibwe were being pushed to the edges. Children were being sent to distant boarding schools where their language was punished out of them. The elders who still carried the full body of songs and stories were aging, and everyone involved understood that when they died, something enormous would die with them. Densmore's official job was to preserve the music. But music, for the Ojibwe, was never only entertainment. A song could be a map. A song could be a medicine. A song could carry the memory of an event that happened long before any European set foot on the continent. And when Densmore began asking where certain songs came from, she started hearing about a time the textbooks did not include. A time before the forests looked the way they do now. A time when the land was shared with something else. Picture one of those afternoons, a small cabin or a shaded clearing, the light going gold in the late day. An old man sits with the horn of the phonograph in front of him, and Frances Densmore sits a little apart with her pencil and her ledger, saying nothing, waiting. He sings. The wax turns. And when the song is done, she asks him, as she always did, what it means and where it comes from. Most days the answer is what you would expect. A hunting song, a dream song, a song for a ceremony. But on certain days the answer wanders somewhere else. The old man explains that the song belongs to a story, and the story reaches back to a time before his grandfather's grandfather, and in that time the people were not alone on the land. There were others here. He describes them without drama, the way you would describe a neighbour who moved away long ago. And Densmore, trained to record and not to judge, writes down every word. The first time it came up in that fuller way, according to how the record reads, it came up almost by accident. An elder was explaining the origin of a particular song, and in doing so he referred to beings who had lived in the region long ago. He called them, in translation, the ones who were tall, the hairy ones. He did not describe them as spirits or as monsters. He described them as people, a different kind of people who had been here first, who had built and shaped and lived, and who had gone away or been driven off or simply faded when the world changed. Densmore, careful and literal in the way she recorded everything, set it down exactly as it was told. She did not editorialize. She did not laugh. She noted it the same way she noted the tuning of a drum. And then, in the accounts that come down to us, the same theme surfaced again with a different person, and then again with another. What makes the pattern so hard to wave away is the consistency of it. These were not people who had gathered together to compare notes and settle on a tale. They were separate individuals, in separate communities, often unable to travel any distance to speak with one another at all. And yet the descriptions rhymed. The hairy ones were said to be enormous, far taller than a grown man, some accounts putting them at twice a man's height. They were covered in hair from head to foot. They were immensely strong, strong enough to move stone and timber that no ordinary group of men could shift. Some accounts describe them as gentle and shy, keeping to the deep woods and the high ridges, avoiding the villages, watching from the tree line, and slipping away before they could be approached. Other accounts describe them as the builders of things, of mounds and markers and old structures whose purpose had been forgotten even by the people who lived beside their ruins. In every version, one detail held firm. They were here before. This was their world first, and the people who told the stories knew themselves to be the ones who came after. The stories did not stop at description. They carried behavior, habit, the texture of something remembered rather than invented. The hairy ones were said to move at night and in the fog, to leave tracks far larger than any bear, to take fish from a line or a trap without ever being seen doing it. There were places a person did not go, high stony ground and certain stretches of old forest, because those places were understood to still belong to them. There were rules about them, the way there are always rules about a powerful neighbour. Do not mock them. Do not follow them. Do not take what is theirs. In some tellings they had once lived closer to the people, even alongside them, in a time when the two kinds shared the land more openly. And then something changed. A cooling, a flood, a war, a slow turning of the world, and the hairy ones withdrew into the wild places and became the shadow at the edge of the fire, the thing the children were told about but rarely saw. What survives in Densmore's material is not a campfire monster, it is the memory of a retreat, a people describing the ones who used to be their neighbours and who are neighbours no longer. One thread that runs through the accounts is the matter of the tracks. Long after the hairy ones themselves had become rare, the sign of them was said to remain. Prints pressed into mud and snow, far longer than a man's foot and deeper, spaced by a stride no person could match. Hunters spoke of finding them at the margins of the deep country, and choosing, wisely, to turn back. There were stories of things carried off in the night, of a heavy shape seen crossing a frozen lake at a distance, of a call in the dark that belonged to nothing anyone could name. None of it was told as thrill or entertainment. It was told the way people pass along the practical knowledge of a dangerous landscape. Here is where they range. Here is how you know they have passed. Here is what you do not do. That register, the flat matter-of-fact tone of people describing a real hazard rather than spinning a tale, is one of the quietest and most convincing features of the whole record. You do not warn your grandchildren, generation after generation, about a creature you invented for fun. It is worth being precise about the language, because the language matters. In the way these accounts were rendered, the hairy ones were not lumped in with the spirits and the powers that fill so much of the tradition. They sat in a different category. They were spoken of as beings of flesh who ate and slept and left tracks and could be avoided or angered, not as visions belonging to the other world. That distinction is the whole difference between a myth and a memory. A spirit explains the unexplained. A neighbour is simply recalled, and the elders, when they described the tall ones, spoke of them the way you'd speak of something once as real and as solid as a moose or a passing stranger, only larger, older, and long since withdrawn. Densmore, who spent her life learning to tell one register from another, recorded the distinction without comment. She did not need to underline it. She simply set down that the people she sat with placed these beings among the living things of the world, and left the weight of that choice for a later reader to feel. This is where the ordinary story of a folklorist and her recordings opens onto something far larger and far more uncomfortable for the official version of the past. Because the land the Ojibwe lived on was covered in evidence of an older order that nobody could fully explain. Across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys stood earthworks of staggering scale, mounds shaped like animals 1/4 of a mile long, geometric enclosures aligned precisely to the movements of the sun and the moon, ramparts and avenues that would have required the coordinated labour of enormous populations, sustained over generations, organised by something that looks a great deal like a state. When the first European settlers encountered these works, they refused to believe that the ancestors of the people living beside them could have built them, so they invented a vanished race of master builders to take the credit, and used that invention to justify taking the land. The irony is brutal. The very idea of a lost builder people was weaponized against the living nations. But strip away the theft and the lie, and a real question remains standing in the field. Who organized all of this? How large and how connected was the world that produced it? And how much of that world had already been lost, even by the time the Ojibwe were telling their stories to a woman with a wax machine? Think about what a monument economy actually requires. You do not raise earthworks that dwarf later cathedrals without surplus food, without trade, without a network that moves goods and labour and knowledge across a continent. And the evidence for exactly that network is in the ground. Copper from the Great Lakes turns up in graves far to the south. Shells from distant coasts turn up far inland. Materials moved across thousands of miles along routes that were already ancient when the mounds were raised. This was not a scattering of isolated villages. This was a connected world, an economy with reach, a system of exchange that tied distant peoples together long before any ship arrived from across the ocean. And then, at some point, much of it came apart. The great centres were abandoned. The networks thinned. The knowledge of who had built what and why decayed into fragments held in song. By the time Densmore arrived, the descendants of that world were being told by their conquerors that they had no history worth the name. When some of them tried to tell the real one, the one that reached back past the ruins to the ones who came before the ruins, the people holding the pencils mostly declined to write it down. Densmore, to her lasting credit, did not decline. Follow that thread and a possibility takes shape that the official version has no room for. What if the ones who came before, the tall builders of the stories, and the builders of the earthworks that no settler would credit to the living nations, were remembered as the same? Not a claim you can prove with a trowel, but look at how the pieces sit together. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. A people who told stories of enormous strong beings who shaped stone and raised structures and then withdrew. A landscape littered with enormous structures whose builders the newcomers insisted on erasing from the record. And a scholarly establishment that treated both the ruins and the stories as problems to be explained away rather than evidence to be weighed. The stories and the mounds were dismissed by the same reflex, for the same reason. Both of them pointed at a past larger and older and more organized than the story the conquerors needed to be true. So both of them were quietly set aside, and the field went silent over ground that was anything but empty. In the last several years, a loose community of researchers has given this suspicion a name and a shape. They point to the strangeness that sits in plain sight all over the world. Structures too large and too refined for the timelines we are given. Old photographs of cities that seem more grand and more built than the sparse populations around them could account for. A recurring sense, once you start looking, that the world we were handed is a salvage operation built on top of something older and greater that was somehow lost. They call the vanished order by different names, and one of them is Tartaria. You can argue with any specific claim in that movement, and many of the specific claims deserve the argument, but underneath the arguing lies a single, stubborn intuition, that there was a world before this one, that it possessed a reach and a knowledge we no longer have, and that, at some point, through catastrophe or conquest or a deliberate resetting of the record, it was cut out of the official story and paved over. What the Ojibwe told Frances Densmore does not prove that idea, but listen to the shape of it, a voice from deep inside a living tradition, recorded before the internet, before the theories, before anyone had a motive to invent it, saying almost exactly the same thing. There were others here before us. They were greater than we remember. They built, and they knew things, and then they were gone, and the world we live in is what was left behind. And here is the part that should unsettle anyone who assumes the past is safely known. A world can be forgotten in a startlingly short time. It does not take 10,000 years. It takes a few hard generations. Break the chain that carries the knowledge. Remove the elders faster than they can pass it on. Scatter the people who hold the map, and within a lifetime or two, the memory thins to rumour, and the rumour thins to nothing. That is not speculation. It is precisely what was being done to the Ojibwe as Densmore worked. The boarding schools, the bans on language and ceremony, the deliberate severing of grandchild from grandparent, were a machine for producing exactly this kind of forgetting. If a modern nation with schools and armies could come within a single generation of erasing a living memory on purpose, then a catastrophe in the deep past, a flood or a plague or a collapse, could have done the same to the world the hairy ones belong to. The reset does not require a conspiracy. It only requires the ordinary, brutal fragility of how human beings hold on to what they know. And Densmore was not the only one who heard it. This is the detail that turns an anomaly into a pattern. All across the same era, collectors and travellers and missionaries who sat with native nations from coast to coast came home carrying versions of the same account. Traditions of a race of giants who had lived before, of tall hair-covered people who kept to the mountains, of builders and first dwellers who had shaped the land and then departed. These collectors did not coordinate. Many of them never read each other's work. Some of them recorded the stories only to dismiss them in the same breath, tucking a paragraph of wonder inside a report otherwise devoted to proving how primitive they believed their subjects to be. But the paragraphs are there, scattered through the archives of the 19th and early 20th centuries, waiting for someone to gather them into one place and notice that they agree. The people of a continent, speaking unrelated languages, separated by mountains and rivers and centuries, kept describing the same thing. Not one story spreading from one source, but many memories pointing back at one reality. So, why has almost no one heard of this? The answer says as much about the people who collected the record as it does about the record itself. Frances Densmore was employed to gather music. When she turned in her manuscripts, the institution wanted songs, transcriptions, and the kind of tidy cultural detail that fit neatly into a catalogue. The stories about tall, hairy builders from a forgotten age did not fit anywhere. They were not music. They were not history as the department defined history. They were, at best, curiosities, and at worst an embarrassment, the sort of thing a serious scientist was expected to note and then quietly step around. So the songs were published and the rest was filed. Boxes of field notes went into archives where they would sit undisturbed for decades. Nobody destroyed them. That is the important part. Nobody had to. In an institution that only publishes what it already considers respectable, the simplest way to erase an idea is to catalogue it, shelve it, and never speak of it again. The truth did not need to be burned. It only needed to be boring to the right people, and it was. There is a further layer here that is easy to miss. For the Ojibwe, and for many of the nations Densmore worked with, the most important knowledge was never written down at all. It was carried in song and in story precisely because those forms survive what paper and stone cannot. A book can burn, a building can fall, but a song passed from grandmother to grandchild, tied to a rhythm and a melody that the body itself remembers, can outlast an empire. When the elders sang into Densmore's machine, some of them may have understood exactly what they were doing. They were placing their memory into a new kind of vessel, a cylinder of wax that could hold a human voice, at the very moment their old vessels were being taken from them by force. And woven into that music, if the accounts are read honestly, were references to the ones who came before, not as fairy tales for children, but as history, as a record of who had lived on this land and what had become of them. A warning, perhaps, about how an entire world can end and be forgotten, because they were watching precisely that happen to their own world, in their own lifetimes, with their own eyes. Now, the honest skeptic has answers ready, and they deserve to be heard. Every culture on earth tells stories of giants, they will say. Folklore is full of hairy wild men and forest guardians, and it means nothing more than that the human imagination runs in similar grooves everywhere. Memory is unreliable across that many generations. Translation distorts. A researcher hears what she is primed to hear. Each of these points has weight, and none of them should be dismissed. But notice what they explain and what they do not. They can explain a single vague monster in a single tradition. They struggle to explain the specificity that keeps repeating. The height, the hair, the strength, the building, the sense of a people who came first and withdrew. They struggle to explain why the traditions land so consistently on the same profile rather than the endless variety you would expect from pure invention. And they cannot explain the physical facts standing in the field, the earthworks and the trade routes and the abandoned centres, the hard evidence of a large lost order that the stories claim to remember. Skepticism is not the same as an explanation, and a shrug, no matter how confident, is not a rebuttal. In recent years, a small number of researchers, most of them working far outside the universities, have gone back to the original volumes and the surviving notes. They have pulled the descriptions out of the margins and laid them beside accounts from other nations, other regions, other centuries. What they find is not a single tidy proof. It is something stranger and more durable, a pattern that refuses to go away. The same figures, tall and hair-covered and impossibly strong, surface in the oral traditions of peoples who never met. The same idea of a builder race that came before surfaces wherever there are ruins too large to explain. And the same institutional shrug greets all of it, the same polite refusal to look, the same instinct to file the uncomfortable thing away and change the subject. You do not have to accept any grand theory to feel the weight of that. You only have to ask why a woman who was trusted to record everything, and who did in fact record everything, left behind an account that the people who paid her had no interest at all in reading. The cylinders themselves survived, against long odds. Thousands of them eventually made their way into the national collections, where for decades they were too fragile to play without risking the very sound they held. Only in more recent times has the technology existed to lift that sound off them cleanly, to hear those voices again as they were on the day they sang. Most of what comes off the wax is music, exactly as intended. But the notebooks that travelled alongside the sound, the context Densmore was so careful to capture, contain the rest. The asides, the origins, the stories that framed the songs, and it is there, in the written margin rather than on the cylinder, that the hairy ones live on, waiting, as they have waited for a century, for a reader willing to take an old woman's careful transcription at its word instead of quietly turning the page. It would be dishonest to tell you that we know what the hairy ones were. We do not. The record is a record of testimony, not of dated bone and carved stone. Frances Densmore did not bring back a body or a photograph. She brought back the sworn memory of people who had no reason to lie to her, spoken in a language she took enormous care to translate faithfully, at a moment in history when their entire world was being dismantled around them. That is not proof in the way a courtroom means proof. But it is not nothing either. It is exactly the kind of evidence on which the study of the deep past is built, the testimony of those who stood closest to it, carried forward by the only people who still remembered. The question is not whether we can be certain, because we cannot. The question is why this particular testimony, almost alone among the thousands of things Densmore collected, was allowed to disappear so completely from the story we tell ourselves about who was here and what they built, and how much we have already managed to forget. Frances Densmore died in 1957 in the same corner of Minnesota where she had begun. She had spent her whole life as a keeper of other people's memory, and she left behind thousands of recordings that scholars are still working through today. Most of that work is exactly what she is remembered for. The music, the ceremonies, the language saved from the very edge of loss. But in the quiet margins of it, in the parts nobody was supposed to care about, she left something else. A door. A rumour from inside a tradition older than the country she worked for. A description, repeated by people who did not know one another, of tall and hairy builders who had lived here first and had been forgotten by almost everyone but the ones who came after them. She did what she always did. She wrote it down, exactly, and she trusted that someone, someday, would decide it mattered. For 100 years, almost no one did. The cylinders spun down and the notebooks yellowed and the world moved on, certain that it already knew its own past. But the record was always there, waiting in a box, patient as the people who first spoke it aloud. And the strange thing about a memory placed carefully into a vessel that can hold it is that it never needed you to believe it. It only needed you, in the end, to finally listen.